Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arwood.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thank you. It's good to see so many people. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, that's great. So to address the topic which was also given to me, our collective impact so far, a brief history of the neuroeducation journey. So I'm going to start with a personal reflection of my journey towards neuroeducation because I have a different viewpoint than most people do regarding the term neuroeducation. Then later in the talk, I will tell how my journey and the viewpoint of neuroeducation at large works together. And then finally, I'll suggest some future elements for that neuroeducation. For me, neuroeducation journey began 56 years ago when my required speech and language methods that were in arts and sciences, coupled with a minor in psychology and an interest in human sciences, did not match with what I was being taught in education for working with complex clinical cases. The situation was that I was to work clinically with an 11-year-old male whom nobody else wanted to work with or supervise. He was deaf, he didn't read, didn't write, he didn't talk, and he didn't sign. He had no formal communication system. He was given an IQ of 35, which is the lowest that you can get on that nonverbal test like that, but he had learned how to be pro-socially developed at age and above age level. To me, that just didn't match. It conflicted with the idea that individuals' development across all domains actually unfold in a parallel fashion. They didn't. My thought was that learning to communicate verbally must be different than learning the physical elements of those domains. And so my journey began. I wanted to find out, how do humans actually acquire language? I looked into books, I read books, I did case studies. I did entire schools where I would evaluate every single student in that school for their language. Some of them were special schools, schools designed specifically for kids with learning problems. Some of them were just general education classrooms. I took classes, I got a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree. That led to supervising and working in a model school set up by Sidney Bijou, who's a protege of B.F. Skinner. So now remember, the year now is 1973, and at this point, students didn't have the option of being able to attend a school and get an education. In fact, if you had a behavior problem, an academic problem, I just didn't like you, I didn't have to teach you. You did not have to go to school. You did not have the opportunity to go to school. So parents would actually take their kids and they would either pay for it, mortgage their homes or whatever, or get a foundation to set up a school. And that school that was set up by Sidney Bijou was one of those special schools. The language taught at that behavioral school was unnatural. So was the language that was learned by imitation. My research at that school led to my doctorate on the deep semantics of language, a very different philosophy from teaching and behavioral principles. And that led to a supervision of a plethora of student studies, research at many schools and clinics, and finally my own courage to break out and use what I knew would work: event-based materials, aligning with what I knew about human science, language, and psychology, a multidisciplinary approach to learning. It was the late 70s and early 1980s. To create pictured events, we needed materials, but we didn't have them. We needed materials that were based upon what we knew about learning and language. We didn't have them. A speech-language therapist, Lynn Wilcox in Nebraska, was sharing my consulting knowledge with her constituents. She offered to raise the $10,000 needed to make Apricot One pictures. Back in the day, the pictures were made by not computers, they were layered in colors. So they were very expensive to make. But those pictures would align with what I knew about language and learning. So Apricot One pictures were developed. It was an acronym, as Chris told you, Arwood Pragmaticism Institute for Communication Therapy. But we had to have a business to sell them through. So Apricot Inc. became the business, and it was a sub-S corporation registered in Texas in the early 1980s. My supervised research continued at the university there, which was Texas Tech University. And it continued also through all my students. I had a plethora of master's and doctoral level students at that school. By 1983, I had written the philosophy behind the methods and materials at Aspen Publishing Company's request. And I called it Pragmatism, Theory, and Application. And I think maybe 200 people have read that book. But they wanted that theory anyway. But there was a lot of science in that philosophy that could not be verified by brain research at the time, at least not at that time anyway. In 1986, I was finally recruited to the University of Portland, and upon arriving, I had 2 very large education grants for using my knowledge in a summer program with students. Again, we collected data. Data showed the effectiveness with learners. But that wasn't our biggest challenge. Our biggest challenge was to get the professionals to shift their paradigms from product-based, bell-shaped teaching, deficit-grounded in behaviorism ideals, to a strength-based set of learning principles parallel to language function. To help educators and families of those with learning language behavior problems, Apricot created a clinic run by Mabel Brown. And by the way, Chris, you did a really nice job of showing all those details that Mabel's been keeping track of all those years. So Apricot then developed more educational materials, as Chris told us, and lots of workshops. And finally, the brain came into this process, and the research caught up about the brain, and so we had the decade of the 1990s, which was the decade of the brain. Knowledge about the brain fostered more acceptance of such a paradigm shift because the research on the brain confirmed there was a parallel between the brain function and language function, something that had been discounted back in the 1960s and 70s and remains discounted under the behaviorism umbrella. The research of the brain led many educators and researchers to apply the knowledge into classroom application, what we would call today neuroeducation. But the methods are still based on behaviorist principles. This is where my journey enters the neuroeducation journey. In May of 2009, Carol Collitz and I presented at the Learning, Arts, and Brain Summit in Maryland. As presenters, we were asked to attend a consortium on neuroeducation at Johns Hopkins. We attended along with 100 others, neuroscientists, educators, and support specialists. Johns Hopkins did a nice job. They laid out their university neuroeducation program that they were to start. Language was missing. Furthermore, 2/3 of the way through the summit, the principal of the consortium's research school said that the brain application to education, brain to education, or neuroeducation commitment was exciting, interesting. But did anyone know how to deal with the special students like those with autism? Carol and I looked at each other. We'd been seated across the room. We looked at each other, and I said, oh, yes, you need to shift paradigms and use language, specifically the Neuro-Semantic Language Learning Theory as your basis. I returned to the University of Portland, and when Dr. Thomas Green became the interim dean, I was allowed to start a neuroeducation postmaster's, master's, eventually doctoral program that triangulated the research from neuroscience and other sciences like speech science and neuroanatomy, psychology grounded on cognitive monality, where the brain and mind are not separate, so they're the same, okay? And language of semantics, pragmatics, and semiotics. Numerous pieces of research using the academic program model, as Chris told us, also known as Arwood's neuroeducation model, have emerged, taking us into the next phase of my thinking about the neuroeducation journey, where biosemiotics is becoming a field of study, and that's exciting to me. Where neurosemantics is routinely used by the scientists, that's the term they use. Where the epistemology, or philosophy of language, that's your semiotics, is again recognized, finally, as critical to understanding all of humanity. And where social justice is about a synergistic relationship between thinking and language, finally. So I'm hoping that this will pull our globe closer together as we pull those pieces up higher into the research realm. And I'm hoping that each of you will add to this journey what you have done, and that eventually someday in the future, we'll have entire schools that are based upon the neuroviconic education system, or NVES. Thank you. I know my 7 minutes are up.